This week, I made a sourdough sandwich bread from 100% whole grain einkorn flour, which is a popular ancient grain. I took a very easy, hands-off approach to making this dough. It was easy to bake as well, with very few specialty tools, and the bread tasted great. It was very nutty and wholesome. Here's how I made it. I started out with a bag of whole grain einkorn flour from the brand Jovial. It seems to be the only brand I can find that carries einkorn flour. The flour looked very similar to whole wheat flour, but I know that it's lower in gluten, so I was planning to treat this bread more like a rye bread, since rye is also very low in gluten. To feed my starter, I took 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter out of the fridge. The starter looks a little bit dark because I used rye flour to feed it the last time, but take 25 grams of whatever kind of sourdough starter you have out of the fridge. It'll work fine. I added 50 grams of water to my starter, then mixed it around with a spoon just to dissolve the starter into the water, and then I added 50 grams of that whole grain einkorn flour. Then I mixed everything together thoroughly to combine, and the starter felt a little bit thinner than what I would expect from feeding the starter bread flour, but it was roughly a pancake batter consistency. So I popped the lid back onto the starter, and I let the starter rise overnight at room temperature for about 9 hours until the starter had doubled in size and was ready to use in my bread dough. To make the dough, I put a mixing bowl on top of my digital scale because weighing out ingredients like flour and water is more accurate than using cups and tablespoons. So that's what I prefer to do. I added 325 grams of water to the mixing bowl and followed that with 100 grams of the active and risen sourdough starter fed with einkorn flour. Then I took all the starter that remained in the jar and put it back into the fridge for next time. It's fairly common to use a little bit of sweetener in whole grain bread recipes, so I wanted to do that with honey this time. I added 20 grams of honey to the liquid ingredients. If you don't want to use honey, you could use an equal amount of white or brown sugar or molasses, or you could leave the sweetener out altogether. I stirred those ingredients together to dissolve the honey and starter into the water, and then I added 450 grams of the whole grain einkorn flour. After that, I added the last ingredient at 10 grams of kosher salt. You can use any kind of salt that you want, pick your favorite. To mix this dough, I took a very straightforward method. I know that einkorn flour doesn't benefit from a lot of gluten development through kneading and stretching and folding. Really, there's not as much benefit there. So I just mixed the dough for a couple of minutes until I got rid of most of those dry bits of flour. And once the dough basically looked like thick concrete, I knew it was ready for its first rise or the bulk fermentation. So I flattened the dough down with the back of a spoon and it was ready to rise. I covered it up with a kitchen towel and let it rise at room temperature for about 3 hours. At the 3-hour mark, my dough was really puffy, not quite doubled in size, but it was very puffy to the touch, and there was a lot of evidence of fermentation. I didn't want this dough to over-ferment, which I know can be a danger for whole grain bread doughs. So I called the first rise over at the 3-hour mark when the dough was looking like this. For the second rise, or the final proof, I got out my favorite non-stick 2-pound loaf pan from USA Pans. You can use any standard loaf pan or get this exact same one that I have with the link that I'll include down below in the video description. For this recipe, your loaf of bread will for the most part take the shape of your loaf pan. So if you use a different pan that's a lot wider, your loaf will end up wide and squat. So I like to use this loaf pan, or if you're using a different one, I would at least use one that looks relatively tall. To shape this bread dough, it couldn't be simpler. I just scooped every last bit of the dough into the bread pan. It's very similar to a batter. And then once I had gotten all the dough into the bread pan, I flattened it down the best I could with a wet spatula. With the dough filling the pan about halfway up, it's time for the first rise. Basically, my goal here is to let the dough rise in the pan until it reaches almost all the way to the top. I don't quite want the dough to double in size fully, but once it almost doubles, that's when I'll cut off the final proof. So I put a damp kitchen towel on top of the dough and I let it rise in the pan at room temperature until it almost doubled in size. And 30 minutes before the dough was done proofing, I preheated my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, making sure I had a middle rack free for the bread pan, and then I put a metal baking pan into the bottom rack of the oven to use for a steam tray. Then I let the oven preheat for 30 minutes. After the dough had been proofing at room temperature for almost 3.5 hours, it had finally reached almost to the top of the pan, almost doubled in size, and it was ready to bake. So I moved the bread to the middle rack of my oven, slid it onto the rack, and then I poured in about a cup of boiling water into the metal baking pan for steam. Do not pour this into a glass baking dish and make sure you don't hit the window of your oven. I shattered a glass baking dish once when I did this. Don't let that happen to you. For the baking process, let the bread bake for 20 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit with steam. Then after the first 20 minutes, remove the steam tray to get that out of there and continue baking for 15 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit until your bread has a nice dark brown color. At that point, pop it out of the oven and place it onto a wire rack or a cooling rack and let it rest for at least 1 to 2 hours. If you don't give your bread enough time to rest, it could result in a gummier bread. And after 2 hours of cooling, this bread was ready to slice and enjoy. It didn't necessarily look like something to write home about, but considering this was made with 100% whole grain einkorn flour, I was really happy with the result. I usually only make 100% whole grain breads for the unique flavor and the additional health benefits anyway. This bread definitely had a moist, tender, closed crumb, and it smelled delicious and nutty as it was cooling down on the rack. As for flavor, this bread was nutty, warm, and wholesome, very similar to a whole grain, whole wheat sourdough bread made with regular wheat flour, but this of course had the additional benefits of being made with an ancient grain with its own unique qualities. I enjoyed some slices of this bread with butter and jam, also with peanut butter and jelly. It was great in both instances. In general, this bread is great for toasting and putting on simple toppings. This has been another video in my 52 Weeks of Sourdough series. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.